Welcome to part 2. In this section, we are going to try to understand the dependently arising nature of a person's sensory experience. In the last section, we ended with this diagram indicating that there is a corresponding sense consciousness for each sense organ, and that for the event of seeing, there was the arising of an eye consciousness. In this section, we will look further into the sensory experience and take a look at the principle of dependent arising and how it applies to the sensory experience. So what is dependent arising? This is a key principle in the Buddha's teaching, which simply means that phenomena arise or come to be depending on certain conditions, and phenomena cease to exist or pass away when these conditions are no longer present. Before we delve into understanding how dependent arising applies to a person and a person's experiences, let's try to understand the principle of dependent arising using a few examples in the physical world. So as you can see here, for this shadow to arise, we must have the sun shining at a particular angle, we must have a tree, and we must have the ground. So depending on the sun, the ground, and the tree, a shadow arises. Similarly, for the light to arise in this lamp, we must have oil in a container, a wick, and a flame. Depending on the oil, wick, and the flame, the light arises. Now let's explore the dependently arising nature of the experience of seeing using this format of the 5 aggregates. We see that when the eye object, and eye consciousness come together, the process of seeing occurs. Not only is there contact between the material eye and the material object, there is also contact between materiality and mentality for the event of seeing to occur. In this process, the designation of what it is that the sense has contacted is accomplished. As I said before, for each type of sense object experienced, there is a corresponding consciousness. In this case, it is eye consciousness. So for all the events of experience by each of the senses, the corresponding consciousness must arise. In other words, depending on the eye object, and eye consciousness coming together, there is seeing. Just like depending on the sun, the ground, and the tree, there is the arising of the shadow. So for simplicity, although we tend to only talk about these 3 components, the eye object, and eye consciousness, all these components of the 5 aggregates are involved in this process. All right, let's look at the other sensory experiences. So once again, for seeing, the eye, the visual object, and eye consciousness organize in a particular way for seeing. For hearing, depending on the ear, the sound object, and ear consciousness, there is hearing. Then, depending on the olfactory object, the nose and nose consciousness, there is smelling. Depending on the taste object, the tongue and tongue consciousness, there is tasting. Depending on the tactile object, the body and the body consciousness, there is feeling. Depending on the mental object, the mind and mind consciousness, there is knowing. So we can also say this in another way. Depending on mind consciousness, mentality, materiality, there is the event of seeing. So this is all there is to our world. There's nothing else that we are doing with our life other than these 6 experiences. There's either seeing, smelling, tasting, hearing, feeling, or knowing. So let's take one more time the event of seeing. So I'm going to say here that the eye organ is interacting with some component of color in materiality. And let's apply the principle of dependent arising here again, because I want to make a point clear to you. So seeing arises when the 5 aggregates, or mentality, materiality, and eye consciousness, organize in a particular way. Now I'm going to say this in a different way. The visual object arises when eye consciousness and mentality, materiality organize in a particular way. Or I can say, depending on the eye consciousness and mentality, materiality, the visual object arises. Now let's look at a famous optical illusion to explain what I mean. Now some of you would have seen a duck at first glance with the beak to this side, and some of you would have seen a rabbit with the nose to this side at first glance. All of us saw the same black and white in this picture, but the image that formed in each one's mind was different. Now I hope it is clear to you what I meant to say when I said the eye object arises depending on mentality, materiality, and eye consciousness. So once again, the eye object arises depending on eye consciousness and mentality, materiality. So this image is not something that exists as an absolute entity, but something that arose in the mind. If it is an absolute thing, then we should all have seen the same thing. Depending on the aggregate of perception of the person, a different image would arise in the mind of each person. And other mental factors, including attention, must also be there for this event of seeing. Once again, I would like to remind you that the mental factors in mentality are needed to recognize the properties of earth, water, fire, and air in materiality, and materiality is needed for the mental factors in mentality to arise. These two support each other, and consciousness brings out the properties of both mentality and materiality to make us aware we are sensing something. All right, do you see now that the eye object and the eye organ, or the sensitive part of the eye, must arise together? You can do a little experiment here and see if this happens by noting that you are only aware of your nose when you smell something. If you are very attentive, you might be able to see the same thing happening with the other senses too. Alright, so along with the sensitive part of the eye arising, there is only I consciousness. There's no other consciousness. Only one type of consciousness can arise at a time. So it becomes clear that it is not one mind that exists over time, but rather the arising and passing of consciousness corresponding to each instance of seeing, hearing, etc. One type of consciousness at a time. All right, now I'm going to show you this animation of the 5 aggregates organizing and reorganizing, a dynamic process in constant flux. Although I cannot simulate the speed of a nanosecond, which is the lifetime of each particular type of consciousness, from this animation I hope to convey the arising and passing of the 5 aggregates that occurs every moment, each set conditioned by the previous in constant flux. So during the event of seeing, I consciousness arises, and this is followed up by the arising of mind consciousness. So usually mind consciousness follows up the arising of each consciousness. So for the event of seeing, I consciousness arises. Then the event of seeing becomes a mental object for the arising of mind consciousness, and so on. And so if you are seeing a flower, say for example, for 1 minute, I consciousness and mind consciousness would arise in quick succession, one after the other, in quick succession for that entire minute in this dynamic process. So each time the 5 aggregates organized for the event of seeing, they arose anew, conditioned by the previous set. So it is not the same I organ or the same I consciousness or the same I object that arises with this dynamic process. So similarly for hearing, knowing, smelling, tasting, feeling, and knowing. A new set of 5 aggregates arising, each conditioned by the previous set. So what is happening here? If all phenomena are dependently arising, then who is the experiencer and what is being experienced? Something doesn't add up. Why do we have the impression of a self that exists over time, that experiences a world around the self that also exists over time? How can this happen? So we will try to answer these questions and solve the mystery of who is the experiencer and what is being experienced in the next section. This brings us to the end of part 2. In this section, we explored the dependently arising nature of a person's sensory experience, and we looked at the 5 aggregates as a dynamic process in constant flux. I hope you will join me for part 3. Thank you.